Stanford University.
Okay, welcome. My name is Walter Scheidel. I'm the chair of the Classics Department here at Stanford. And welcome to the 8th Lawrence Eitner Lecture on Classical Art and Culture. It's a lecture series the department has run for the last number of years in order to publicize classics, classical scholarship to a wider audience. So thank you for coming, for braving the rescheduling and the inclement weather, by local standards at least, and for finding this new venue. This series has been endowed by two of our benefactors, Peter and Lindsay Joost, who are ordinarily here, but I guess they have trouble finding this room. It was endowed in honor of Lawrence Eitner, who died a number of years ago. He was the director of the Stanford Art Museum, what's now the Cantor Art Museum, for quite a long time, from the 60s to the end of the 80s. And he was really instrumental in raising its profile from a rather provincial collection to a major regional art collection and institution of teaching and research. Our distinguished speaker tonight is Peter Meineck, a professor of classics and ancient studies at New York University at NYU, and also the founder of the Aquila Theater 21 years ago. Now, we always say we are very grateful for people to come here and talk to us. In this case, we are really grateful because last week when Peter was meant to talk, this was made impossible by the superstorm. We were very lucky that he caught the right window to escape from New York City before the blizzard hit. So we are really indeed very unfortunate to be able to welcome Peter here today. Professor Meineck is originally from London. He holds a PhD in classics from the University of Nottingham, where he is currently an honorary professor of classics. He also founded the Aquila Theater, as I just said, back in 1991, a theater whose mission it is to present innovative productions of classical, i.e. ancient drama. He has been very active in the performing arts in a wide range of places, from New York City and London to Greece and the Bermudas, as I learned recently, and in venues as diverse as Carnegie Hall, the Lincoln Center, the ancient stadium at Delphi in Greece, and the White House. He has produced and or directed over 50 shows. He has written, translated, or adapted about 24 plays, and he has written several literary adaptations for the stage, such as The Man Who Would Be King, Canterbury Tales, The Invisible Man, and Catch-22. He has also designed lighting for dozens of other shows, so he's very much involved in the performing arts. He has created the Aquila Theater's education program at Frederick Douglass Academy in Harlem, and several national theater education programs. Academically, Professor Meineck specializes in the performance, reception, history of ancient drama. He has published quite a number of volumes of translations of Greek comedy and tragedy, especially by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Aristophanes. And he has written widely in journals and edited volumes on the subject of reception and performance of ancient drama. And he also works as a Greek literature and mythology consultant, including to Will Smith on the movie I Am Legend, which I'm sure our grad students in classics will be pleased to know. You can actually become a Greek literature and mythology consultant and make money in Hollywood. I mean, who would have guessed? And then in addition to all of this, he's director of the National Endowment for the Humanities program called Ancient Greeks, Modern Lives, a national collaboration between the theater and a number of public libraries. Now, this program has a special focus on military veterans, and for that reason, last year was invited to perform at the White House. In recognition of his outstanding accomplishments, Professor Meineck has received numerous, and I guarantee you very numerous, prestigious grants and awards for his work. His main project right now is the intersection of cognitive theory and ancient drama. In fact, he's currently working on an entire book on this topic entitled The Embodied Theater, Cognitive Studies of Greek Drama. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that's also the topic of his lecture tonight. And we are very grateful indeed for giving us a preview of this exciting and genuinely cutting-edge work. And that's why we are lucky to be in this venue, because this is a cutting-edge science building. Few professional classicists have done as much to popularize ancient culture beyond the ivory tower as our speaker tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Meineck, our Lawrence Eitner lecturer this year.
Thank you, Walter and Margot, for suffering all my trials and tribulations. I volunteer as an EMT in my town, so it was an exciting week. That's my fantasy. That's what I would really do if I could give all this up. So it was quite an exciting week last week. And now we have this storm called Athena that's arrived, that's appropriate. I have all these photos of my kids in snowsuits making snow angels and stuff, so I'm missing out on that. But it's great to be here, and I literally got here in the window. And I haven't been to Stanford since, I think, 1993, where we came with a production of the Scottish play. Can't say the name of it because this is kind of a theatre, you understand. So it's really lovely to be back with a new project that's something I've been working on for the past 2 or 3 years. And from the outset, I'm going to say I'm not a cognitive scientist and I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm very interested in engaging and am engaging with people from those fields. I'm part of a neuroaesthetics group at NYU. And this is really turning into some wonderful projects. And many of my colleagues who work in those fields are very interested in working with and talking to artists in dance and theatre and music. The area that we're all moving into are these cognitive gaps that are so fascinating. And I think it's in those cognitive gaps where great art lies. And sometimes bad art as well, actually. And I'm very interested in the cognitive gap. And so my current project, which I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, is this sort of intersection between cognitive theory and ancient drama. And what can we tease out of current cognitive theory? What can it tell us about ancient drama? The reason that I'm interested in this approach is I'm interested in reception, but I'm also interested in the reception of the original plays, which is kind of unfashionable at the moment, actually. I want to know as much as I can about why these plays were created, how they worked, how they functioned. This is the theatre guy in me. All great art has techniques and craft behind it. And I'm very interested in trying to understand the craft of ancient drama. And I feel some of these cognitive approaches have certainly given me some new tools to think about some old questions. And of course, the first question is, and I'm using the term neuroscience here to really cover the science of the brain, can neuroscience be applied to the ancient Greek brain? And, to persuade you as classicists that this stuff can work, there's a lot of elephants in the room that we need to get out of the way. Many times I hear, well, isn't neuroscience deterministic? What about culture? What about geography? Well, I actually think that there's very interesting new fields of neuroscience, cultural neuroscience, anthropological neuroscience, where neuroscientists themselves are coming up against these problems and are very interested in talking to us. We study culture. That's what we do. We're really good at it. We're interdisciplinary. We study art, architecture, anthropology, literature, texts. I think that we should have a seat at this table, and I think there's a lot that we can add to how humans cognate and how they have cognated. The problem is that there's no one area that we can call cognitive theory. Those of you who work in this will know. I'm showing you a video, actually, of one of my favorite skits. This is Monty Python's famous philosophers' football match between Greece and Germany, because I think it really underscores really the problems that are going on in philosophy of the mind. There really isn't much agreement as to how we think and how we cognate. And this was truly genius. And one of the few times Greece has beaten Germany in soccer, actually. And some of the arguments are up here that go all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, of course, right? There's the Greeks, right? There they are. Rationalist versus empiricist, nature versus nurture, innate versus learned, biology versus culture, computational versus embodied. And as we enjoy this wonderful sketch, I just want to pick out some of those things. It's pulling way too much focus on my talk. But you know, I've spent a good year. I realized when I started my book, I needed to really go and understand these arguments. And I've spent a good year in the world of philosophy of the brain, and it really does feel like the philosopher's football match. But what's interesting is, as I came out of this process, I realized that much of what I was experiencing and knowing from my work as a theatre director was this idea of embodied cognition. Now, my colleague at NYU, Joseph Ledoux, who works on the emotions and cognition, has come up with what I think is a very good diagram of, you know, cognitive workspace. There's not one unified thing that we're looking at here. There's environmental stimuli. Well, we study that as classicists. Explicit memory. We're also good at thinking about memory and how memory operates in the texts and the art that we study. Body feedback. Well, I'll talk a little bit about that because that's very much the realm of the actor and the dancer. Central nervous system arousal. Well, here's some deterministic stuff. We all have these functions. They're provoked by different forms and different mechanisms, but we all have flight or fight. We all have an endocrine system. We all have hormones. Language as well, which plays a part in cognition, and our survival circuit activity. So Joe Ledoux's model is a good sort of roadmap into cognitive workspace. This is sort of how I've sectioned off my current study into some of the ways I'm thinking about cognition and ancient drama. The neuroscience of the mask is what I'm going to be talking about today, but I'm thinking about space, movement, music, narrative patterning, the cognitive life of props, who knew, color and perception, group dynamics of spectatorship, choral identity. There's an enormous amount of fascinating work being done on racism and ethnic identity in neuroscience, which I think is fascinating when we think about the chorus and why you constantly, well, frequently have choruses of young Athenian males playing characters who are as far away from Athenian identity as you could possibly imagine. And cognitive catharsis. I want to actually dare to go there and readdress this question of catharsis. Well, let's unpack some of this. Now, colleagues working in other areas have been able to suggest some tools to approach some of these mechanisms. Cognitive archaeology is one area that's been very useful to me. Various people in archaeology are using cognitive tools to think about particularly early human activity, the Paleolithic brain, tool making, language, and this is starting to creep into classical archaeology now. So this is not completely new territory. There's also people working in literature in the brain. There's a group here at Stanford that have been doing studies with fMRI brain imaging and people reading Jane Austen, which is fascinating. And there's also a few people working on theatre and cognition. So there are a few people out there, and I've been able to draw on some of these studies. To tackle this whole idea of sort of determinism, I want to bring up the work of Nisbet, which is quite controversial. And when I first was pointed to Nisbet, about 10 years ago, and he's been working on this area for most of his career, was one of the first people in neuroscience to really challenge the whole idea of determinism by suggesting that there were different ways that humans cognated. And the problem with the scientific method, I think, for those of us that work in humanities, is scientists, of course, are forced to create controls in their experiments. So it's hard for us sometimes to read that literature and hear, well, I had 15 Asians and 15 Westerners, and we start to sort of question and get very suspicious of some of these kind of quantifiables that are put on people. But this is the scientific method, and they have to start somewhere, and we have to understand that. Nisbet looked at what he termed East Asians and what he termed Westerners, people in Northern Europe and America, and came up with science that showed that, as far as he was concerned, people from East Asian countries were field dependent. They were more holistic thinkers. They thought more in terms of group and area rather than specifics, and that people from the West were perhaps more field independent and more individual. And he termed this, he described this as the Aristotelian brain, which I thought, great. The Aristotelian brain, I've just completely proved that we've got a direct route between our brain and the ancient brain. But of course, it's not as simple as that. And just like I'm daring to go into neuroscience, this is a neuroscientist daring to go into classics. And I don't really know what the Aristotelian brain is, and I don't know if I'd ever like to meet it. having, being a great lover of Aristotle, of course. And then the Confucian brain was the other brain that he brought up. Now, I have to say, Nisbet has now moved away from this idea, and his thoughts are more complex now. But ultimately, one of his cognitive tests was to ask people to look at a fish tank. And what he came up with was that people with the Confucian brain would be able to describe in much greater detail the background, and people with his Aristotelian brain would be able to describe the size of the fish. And this is field dependency versus field interdependency. And to a certain extent, there is some truth in this science, and he did set out to prove that culture impacts cognition. Not everything is biological. So we are bio-psycho-social creatures, and I would hope that at least the social side, as classicists, were already involved in. I'm very interested in eye tracking, and I think that eye tracking experiments can tell us a lot about how people cognate. This is Yarbus's famous experiments where here's a nice Russian girl and somebody looking at her with their pupils being tracked, our eyes saccade. And Yarbus proved that when we look at faces, and I'll come back to this when I talk about the mask, I say we, Yarbus's subjects looked intently at the eyes and the mouth. Well, do we all look like that? Does everybody perceive faces the same way? Well, let's take a look at our friends, the gorillas, and look at primates. And primates do actually look heavily at faces. If you show them a complete body and a face, the primate will look intently at the face. They look in a more linear pattern, and you'll notice that humans look more of a triangle, eyes and the mouth, but not all humans. But primates too do look intently at faces. Faces are very, very important. And I'm going to get to this question of what's so important with faces, because it gets to my question about the mask. If faces are so important, why would you disguise them? Why would you ever wear a mask? We were talking about this in a drama class this afternoon. What we know about ancient drama in the 5th century is it's movement-based, it's full of dance, music, singing. Wearing a mask is the worst thing that you could possibly do in that kind of art form. So I'm interested in what's the impact of wearing a mask, why do we wear a mask, and how do we cognate when we're wearing a mask? Well, to get back to Nisbet, what's interesting is that if you look at the Western faces, these are Western people looking at faces and East Asian people looking at faces, the red dots are Western, and the blue dots are East Asian. The East Asian subjects seem to look intently at the nose. And the Westerners look at the eyes and the mouth. This is really fascinating because if you look at no masks, they do have sizable noses, right? The nose on a no mask is one of the most, prominent features of looking at those masks. And if you look at 5th century, and these are only vases and sculptures from the 5th century, the noses are actually quite delicate and quite small. These are not Asterix, big Greek profile noses. These are quite small noses. This is kind of interesting because maybe we have some evidence here for how the Greeks may have cognated. Maybe the masks show us, in the terms of the way they're constructed, that their cognition was not dissimilar to our cognition. What Nisbet does show, and what these studies that have come after him show, is that culture has an impact. So, for example, one study took Chinese students who had grown up in Hong Kong and gone to English schools. When they showed these students a British flag and they looked at faces, they looked at the eyes and the mouth. When they showed them a Chinese flag and they looked at faces, they looked at the nose. So that's within the same experiment. So culture is important. Now, one thing that you'll notice about these Greek masks, and I'll get back to this, is their eyes. And I'm going to focus today on the mask, and I'm going to focus on the visual aspects of the mask. And, the Greeks loved their eyes. Here's some beautiful statue eyes from the Metropolitan Museum. And we forget sometimes that the eyes set in statues were a very prominent and important part of engagement with the plastic art that is statuary, which, must have a relationship to the construction of the mask. We can think about eye cups, the Symposium eye cup. Very interesting, the Symposium eye cups. Room for a whole other talk on these things, but they're very, very popular in the mid to late 6th century. And then they completely disappear when drama and tragedy starts to develop in Athens. And they come back again towards the end of the 5th century. And they definitely have a strong relationship with Dionysus. And of course, at the bottom of these cups, when you drain them, would often be some wonderful eyes staring back at you. And we can think of the ophthalmoi, the eyes that were on the front of Greek ships. And the eyes of the owl, of course. And I'm going to come back to money later. If you've ever seen owl eyes, right, they're incredible. They definitely have a relationship to these representations that we see in Greek vases. And here's Dionysus, of course, with his freaky eyes, right? So eyes are very important when thinking about how the Greeks themselves thought about the act of going to the theatre. Remember, theatre means seeing place. The Romans called their theatres auditoriums, right? Hearing places, but these are seeing places. So the visual is very important. Now, one thing about eyes and cognition is that everybody just look at each other for a sec. Just look into each other's eyes. Do it deeply and intently, right? It's kind of awkward, isn't it, right? You know, we're comfortable looking into each other's eyes. You know, cognitive scientists tell us the only times we really look into each other's eyes are, you know, when we're fighting or doing that other thing that begins with F that I will not mention, but... And actually, we are the only mammal that really has whites, right? Most mammals, if not all mammals, don't have sclera. They don't have whites. They don't want their eyes to be seen. Either they're hunters or they're being hunted. So the whites of the eyes is very, very important. And looking at gaze direction and where eyes are looking is something that's very key to the Greek mask. Not having eyes is kind of disturbing, right? And yet, most of us probably think of the Greek mask as not having eyes. What's interesting is that Western cognition, if that's Greek cognition, showed us that when people look at faces, they look at the eyes and the mouth intently. They're looking there for emotion and expression. The reason that we look intently into the eyes when we fight is we're looking for that saccade, we're looking for that moment where something's going to break. And yet, most disguises don't really take the eyes away, right? They actually frame the eyes. And yet, you know, Zorro's disguise and the Lone Ranger's disguise, I mean, they're pretty effective, right? I mean, you really don't know who that is. And there's the Pussy Riot ski mask, of course, right? The quintessential villain's disguise. And these wonderful masks that look very much like Greek tragedy masks, except they don't have eyes. Greek tragedy masks and comedy masks had eyes. They faced us. The term for mask that we first find on an inscription in the 5th century, and then we don't find it again until Aristotle's Poetics, is prosopon, which I translate a bit freely as before the gaze. So the mask is before the gaze of the viewer. To put on the mask is to stand before that viewer and to perform. I do an experiment with my students, NYU. We go out into Washington Square Park, and I say to one of them, stand there. Nothing happens. Then they put on a mask and they stand there. Within 5 seconds, there's a crowd of 30 people that have gathered around them expecting something to happen. The mask is a call to theatre. It's very, very powerful. And this is a mask from the Pronomos vase, dated to the end of the 5th century. And this is my model mask, which I'll be coming back to. But I want you to notice the eyes and how naturalistic this mask is. Now, thinking about the representations of masks on Greek vases, we should also think about this in cognitive terms. Whenever you see a mask, and there's very few actual examples of, this is a satyr mask found at the Agora in 96, there's very few examples of masks from the 5th century. Most of the masks that we see in our books are Hellenistic masks or Roman masks, nothing to do with the 5th century Athenian theatre. But look at this one. Here's a fragment of a satyr mask, and it's literally coming to life in the hands of the actor, the expressiveness in his fingers. And I love the gaze direction on the aulos player, who's, you know, taken back by the liveness of the mask that's literally exploding in his hand. So the vase painter's very interested in the cognitive effects of the mask. This is one of my favorites. I had such a hard time getting an image of this, and I know I'm being recorded, so I probably shouldn't admit this, but this is a fragment of a vase from the Black Sea, and it's in a museum in Kiev, and they will not give up a photograph of it. They won't reply to emails or letters or phone calls. And this is a scan from something, and finally Eric Chapo told me, yeah, this image was taken with a cell phone camera by a German PhD student who doesn't want to admit that it's her image. And, but actually, it's an amazing shot of chorus members performing in their masks, these beautiful white female masks. There's the aulos player. But I love this guy who's the assistant, this young man who's the assistant of the aulos player, and he's probably holding the reed case for the aulos. And his job is to keep an eye on the aulos player and change the reeds. But he has become transfixed by the mask. He can't take his eyes off it. I think it's a beautiful little study on the power of masks. And here you can see another man who's just about to, a young boy who's just about to dress, 18-year-old, if he perhaps dress as a female chorus member. That mask is, facing us. So we engage very directly with the eyes of the mask. But look at his gaze direction. Again, he's totally transfixed by the mask of his fellow choral performer, dressed as a Maenad. See if I can get this going. Is that going to work? Yeah. Well, our eyes are fascinating because they move, they saccade. And Michael Spivey has an amazing work called Continuity of Mind. He works a lot in gaze direction. And what's interesting about the way we cognate is Spivey has proved that actually our eyes move before we have the thought. Our eyes actually go to the place before we even think about going to that place, which is very interesting when you think about drama and the anticipation of drama, because I know as a director that my job is to literally keep you on the edge of the seats. And Aristotle says the same thing. I have to constantly make you anticipate what's going to happen next. Spivey's theory is that we actually don't see movement. So if I do this with my arm, you're not seeing that. What you're seeing is that, and that. And people with lesions on their parietal cortex actually do just see that, and that. They can't cross the road. They can't judge traveling distances. What we're doing is we're guessing. Based on our experience, we're making guesses of movement based on these saccading snapshots, which is why every now and again, if somebody makes a gesture next to you, you misinterpret that gesture and your sort of central nervous system makes you flinch, believing that maybe that you're going to get struck because, evolutionarily, you're going to make the best decisions for your survival. Well, I think this has profound implications for the way that theatre's received. And right, being in a darkened room and watching bad theatre for 1 hour is the longest hour of your life, right? Cognitive anticipation, I think, is very, very important. And it's fascinating to actually even read Shakespeare. Most actors read Shakespeare, including my actors, to the end of the line, right, or the end of the speech. But Shakespeare embeds his text with these sort of explosions in the middle of a line. He makes us anticipate what's going to happen next. So I think that saccading eyes tell us a lot. And one of the experiments that we've just applied for NSF funding for is to actually watch people watching theatre and eye track where their eyes are going and what they're anticipating. I think that would be fascinating. Well, to move back to cognition and really relate it to the Greeks, cognition changes. And one study came out in 2003, which was looking at a society in rural Mexico. This was a culture that was not monetized at all. It was an agrarian-based culture that dealt in exchange. And the culture's been studied for about 30 years, and then it became monetized in the 1980s. And it was a study of weaving. And when the culture became monetized, cognition changed. The patterns in the weaving changed, relationship changed, gender relationship changed in the community. People started to travel more. This is a very rich and deep study, but actually, this can be applied to some of Seaford's recent work on money, which I think is very interesting. He also takes the view that the monetization of the Greek world in the mid-6th century also led, he doesn't quite say it's a cognitive change, but certainly a cultural change. And, there's those owls again with their big eyes, right? And some of Seaford's quotes up here, 2 results of a monetized society, philosophy and tragedy, focusing on the extreme isolation of the individual from the gods and his or her own kin. So in a way, Seaford's coming to this similar Nisbet idea that what was a field-dependent culture is monetized and mutates into a field-independent culture, where individualism becomes much more important. Well, I think we could probably see these things happening, certainly in Athens, around the mid-6th to late 6th century in education, what Jas Elsner has called a visual turn in art, in writing, in the development of narrative drama, which is a brand new thing, in social and political reforms. There's Cleisthenes' web, right? In sea power, trade and cultural exchange. So I'm going to say that there's a cognitive turn that happens around 500 BC in Athens. And I think a lot of this stuff is spinning from this cognitive turn. And I think we can start to see these ancient thoughts encapsulated in literature and art. So how did the Greeks cognate? Well, who are the Greeks, right? Did an Athenian cognate in the same way as a Spartan? Did an Athenian Thete cognate in the same way as an Athenian aristocrat? Well, this is a tricky area. There's some wonderful studies that I was reading recently during the election that Republicans cognate differently to liberals, right? Republicans have bigger amygdalas because they're more emotional, and liberals have, higher functioning parietal cortex because they're more analytical. And there are studies out there that will show you this. So even within our culture, right, we can't settle on, what is American cognition. I think it's a really interesting area, and I don't think there's one way of cognition in any culture, but I think there's generally cultural agreed upon ways that people think they cognate. And what I think I find in Athenian culture is an idea of embodied cognition, that thought is embodied. Here's, one of the greatest examples of embodied cognition that I could find anywhere, which is Athena being born fully armored, fully grown out of the head of Zeus, right? This idea of intellectualism and Sophia and reasonableness comes out of the head of Zeus. And often when we see the pre-Socratic philosophers or even the tragic playwrights describing emotion or cognition, there's a sense of embodiment. This is not Cartesian thought, and I think one of my challenges is to separate myself. I mean, whether I like it or not, I'm a Cartesian, right? But as a theatre director, I'm not a Cartesian. I hate seeing performances where I have an actor who's acting from the head up. He may or she be reciting superb Shakespeare, but their body is lying. And a lot of what we do with actors is try and get their body to feel truthfully what the words are saying at the same time. Very difficult in classical theatre. I love this moment from Agamemnon where the chorus talk about Agamemnon coming home. I've seen him come home myself. I witnessed it with my own eyes. I mean, they know something bad's going to happen. But my soul still echoes with the drone of the lyreless hymn. I have learned the fury's dirge of death and lost all strength of hope. Now look at this for embodied cognition. The truth twists in my guts. My heart throbs with foreboding. My head spins at the thought of the fulfillment of justice. Now we too use a lot of language of embodiment to describe our emotion. We do in the theatre. I was rolling in the aisles. I was on the edge of my seat. We often use language to embody our thoughts. So my proposal, and I think the parts of cognitive science that I'm borrowing from are definitely embodied cognition, that we are not just brains. Alva No's work, out of our heads. We're not just the brain and everything happens within. We are connected to our body, and our body is connected to the outside environment. This is Malforos is a cognitive archaeologist version of cognition as embodied, the body and the mind, situated in action, distributed beyond the individual, mediated, it's socially embedded, it's extended beyond the skin, it's enacted. So our brain is not invatted. It doesn't sit, we couldn't take the human brain, put it in a vat like a computer and give it stimulus and it would still respond. It has to be connected to the rest of our body, and our body has to be connected to the experience of being in the world. So our thoughts are extended. I want to demonstrate that with a game of Tetris, right? Extended mind theory. So 3 ways we could possibly solve the problem of Tetris, right, as the game plays. We could solve the problem internally using only your brain. Now that's hard, right, to think about where these pieces are going to go without being able to manipulate them, which is what we do with Tetris. Or we could implant a neuromechanism into our brain which helps with shape processing. Or we use extended mind theory, which is we're allowed to use a computer keyboard or a joystick to manipulate the shapes as they fall. And I think it would be impossible to play Tetris without being able to actually manipulate these shapes. So this is a sort of battle between the computational mind and the extended mind. And if we can sort of apply this to ancient culture, a couple of terms I might use. You've heard this, an exogram is a mental concept stored on an external device, right? Pen and paper is an exogram, stylus and wax. There we see an ancient laptop, a stylus and wax there. chiseling, inscription, brush and painting, these are all exograms. An engram are concepts stored in biological memory, contained in the nervous system and therefore perishable. We have both, right? But we need exograms. We need to be able to record things beyond our minds. Well, I think Athenian culture is an embodied culture. I think that they moved as much as they possibly could, whether it was in athletics, in warfare, rowing or being in a hoplite phalanx, as a processional culture. And Greek tragedy was nothing if not processional drama. Here's my colleague Richard Schechner's famous napkin drawing of the sort of one of the origins of drama in procession, where we have a procession that stops, we have an informal audience gather, and the procession leads its way to a planned event at the end of a procession, normally a sacrifice. And if anybody loved to process, it was the ancient Athenians. I mean, there are something like over 100 known processions that took place in Athens in the 4th century. And of course, the Festival of Dionysus itself was bounded by a procession, and the drama was processional drama. Well, I want to talk a little bit about that end point of the procession and embodied cognition and really start to prove my point. I should say to Walter, during the blackout, I had no power, but I had access to my PowerPoint. So I've worked this PowerPoint so many times. So if I go on too long, pull my power, right, when I hit my allotted time. Because I'm very enthusiastic about this stuff. Well, here's the site of the Sanctuary of Dionysus Eleutherius. And here you can see it, the aerial view of it. And, you know, it's in the sacred heart of Attica. You know, what Aeschylus actually calls the eye of Athens, right, the Acropolis. This is the spiritual heart of the city. And we know how important this sanctuary was, because Thucydides tells us that even in the most trying times of the plague and the population being gathered between the long walls, one of the places they were not allowed to use was the Sanctuary of Dionysus. So being allowed into this space was very, very important. And the mask itself operates within this embodied space. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, here's Felix Bonfel's photographs of the Acropolis in 1860, and you really get an impression of what a rock the Acropolis was. This was a high place. The theatre hasn't been excavated yet, there it is. So when you went up onto the Acropolis, you were sitting in the sky, and that's really important to understand how Greek drama operates. Here's a shot of the view. So the seeing place that was the theatron at the Sanctuary of Dionysus was far more on the place where you saw plays. It was also a place where you engaged with the environment. It was also called the Sanctuary of Dionysus Eleutherius, named after Eleutherae. Well, Eleutherae, here it is the most northern part of Attica that borders those nasty Boeotians, those Thebans, right? There's Mount Kithaeron. It's a liminal place. It's a place of mist and mountains, and Dionysus, of course, is a god of liminality. He inhabits those places. So the Theatre of Dionysus is this liminal sky space. I should say that most of you probably know this, but the new archaeology that's coming out, that's being done right now, is telling us that unfortunately the Theatre of Dionysus in the 5th century wasn't this magnificent circular stone auditorium that we all grew up with. It was a rather dumpy frontal 5,000 seat space. Looked more like the theatre at Thorikos, but you know what? This is my reconstruction of what the space probably looked like at the time of the Oresteia in 458 BC. But this makes complete sense for a theatre of the mask. A complete sense for a theatre where the mask is gazing at you. Here's a stadium in Brazil called Eco Stadium, which is a 5,000 seat space of benches on a hillside, which I think gives you a good impression of the simplicity of the theatre space in the 5th century. By about 430, 420, some stone seats were erected and the skene started to become stone. But prior to that, it was really a temporary structure, partially temporary, erected only for that festival. But look at that view. This is a visual experience. That's a hard act to follow, doing a show in a space like this. And I've done a lot of open air theatre, and it's a very, very different cognitive dynamic. I'm going to need your help now because I am a theatre director, so I want to demonstrate what I'm talking about. As classicists, we get bogged down in text. And one of the ideas behind my project is to move away from the text and to see the text as actually the final part of theatre and not the first part of theatre. That's heresy, I think, in my field to a certain extent, but I want to demonstrate an element of human cognition that proves that the text is really not important. So can I have 2 volunteers? It's really, really easy. I need 2 volunteers. Volunteer now, it gets worse later. 2 volunteers. Come on, I need grad students, right? You guys, you 2, you're volunteering. Come on, this is really easy. Come out front. This is, some of you know this, right? This is called the McGurk effect. Okay, so stand here. Actually, you stand here. And you, back to back. No, face, there you go, that's it. Back to back, right. I want you to say ba, 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 and nothing else. Try that.
Ba, ba, ba,
Louder.
Ba, ba, ba,
You hear that?
ba.
Yes.
Okay, I want you to mouth. Try that. And really over-enunciate. When I point at you, I want you to change it to a far sound. But don't change what you're saying. Show me that. Really, really enunciate. Now change to a... You see that? Okay. So, we'll start with the bars. You're just doing bars. Okay, go.
Ba, 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 ba.
What do you hear?
Ba, ba,
Change back.
ba, 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 ba,
Keep going.
ba, ba,
Change back.
ba, 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 ba.
It's uncanny, right? Thank you. That was excellent. The McGurk effect shows us 2 things, right? It shows us, first of all, that we don't see with our eyes, we see with our brain, right? That's really, really important. Careers of many magicians are based upon that premise, and many people in the theatre, right? The second thing it shows us is that our visual stream will always trump our auditory stream. Well, not always. I think maybe if we hear a scream or something, our sort of central nervous system might kick into action, but it will definitely trump the stream that processes language. Because we've been processing visuality a lot longer than we've been processing language. And that's like an actor reciting Shakespeare and his or her body is not at all feeling the words that they're speaking. We've all experienced those kind of performances. So that's my case for visuality, putting visuality front and center in the experience of the theatre. It doesn't mean that the text is not important. I just think that we tend to start at the text first. And I want to give us some tools where we can come to the text later. So here's some tools. Why am I showing you a test pilot? Well, a gentleman called Fred Previck was working for the US Air Force and was given the task of figuring out why pilots black out when they lose the horizon. It's quite common. This is actually how John Kennedy died. He lost the horizon, he crashed a plane. And what Previck did is rethink 3-dimensional space and put it into 4 spatial areas. This is an embodied idea of 3-dimensional space. And I think if we can use Previck's model to think about the ancient theatre, we can start to understand the impact of what it would have been like to watch an ancient play. So here we have these 4 dimensions of space, which I'll take us through with my lovely Greek audience here. Now this, of course, is an audience for a chariot race, but it's the only audience I've got, so bear with me. So this is peripersonal space. I told you I had way too much time with this PowerPoint. This is peripersonal space, which is the space that you can touch. That's your peripersonal space. So you've got that. There it is, peripersonal space. The next element of space is focal extrapersonal space. This is what you see in your foveal vision. Everybody do this. This is your foveal vision. If you were wearing a mask, this is what you would see. We're going to come back to this later because when you drop your foveal vision, you'll thank goodness my peripheral vision is back again. And I definitely think that the ancient theatre is exploiting the fact that we see by oscillating between peripheral and foveal vision. Right, so that's what we're looking at. Action extrapersonal space is landmarks, things that we would use to move through a space geographically. And of course, I'm not the only person to tell you that what was seen by the audience in terms of what was on the Acropolis, what was in the old southern city, was key to understanding how their social memory worked. In the Agamemnon, the chorus say, "Yet above is one Apollo, Pan, Zeus." There is indeed 3 caves to Apollo, Pan, Zeus above them on the Acropolis. And there's been Ruth Scodell has done some wonderful work on social memory and how what was seen in the city was woven into the fabric of ancient drama. Now we have what I'm interested in, which is ambient extrapersonal space, right? This is sitting in the sky. This is something that when we go and see a Greek play today, we don't often get. We can find a Greek play, we put it into a black box, we shine lights on it, we make you look. I think this is key to understanding the dynamism of ancient drama. What's interesting is that when we cognate, right, when we think hard about something, we tend to look up. You can try this experiment on each other. You can look at a friend and say, "What's your favorite food?" And then say, "Tell me the last time you had that food." And they'll instantly look up. And you can see it in babies as well. We actually go and look into that space. Everybody does it, right? It's a great photo, isn't it? Okay. So I think we have to, first of all, cognitively place these plays in this kind of space where you're actually allowed to move your eyes and your vision away from the foveal vision of the performance and think about these concepts and be more reflective. This is something that many of us in the theatre are uncomfortable doing with drama. We have to keep you there, hold your attention, make you watch this. This is how we get oppressed. I think it's a very different experience in this space. And this is why we must have the mask. The mask is a visual call to attention in that space. When that mask goes into that orchestra, which wasn't circular, right? But when it walks into that orchestra, straight away that thing is in your foveal vision. It's no bigger than a human face. There's no megaphone mouth. It's quite naturalistic. But we are so dependent on looking for faces that when a face is taken away, we're going to watch. And it's hard to take your eyes off somebody wearing a mask. Here's the mask that I showed you before. And I want to talk a little bit about how this mask operates. Here's Mona Lisa. And Leonardo here also knows how we look at the corners of the eyes and the corners of the mouth. And so he's presented them in sfumato, right? And then he's given you this, this background that really pulls your peripheral vision, these meandering rivers, and this is Margaret Livingston's example of peripheral and foveal vision, which is superb. Everybody look really closely at her mouth and focus on her mouth. And then look at the background, and then focus on her mouth again. And for some of you, it will change. It doesn't happen for everybody. And this is, of course, what makes it compelling. Is she smiling? Is she frowning? And, you know, she has this enigmatic expression because Leonardo is playing around with peripheral and foveal vision. If we look at the way masks are presented in Greek vases, it's interesting because they're not photographs, but the vase painter has chosen certain features. Big, thick bottom lip, big eyes, furrowed forehead, and smooth areas, just like Leonardo around the eyes. Here's the actor holding the mask, quite different features. I think that's deliberate. Peripheral and foveal vision comes into play. Take a look at this, right? Dr. Angry and Mr. Calm. If you actually squint a little bit, you might see these faces change. See if that works. I can help you with it. You see that? I fuzzed it there. You can see them change there, right? What happens is one is in your fine or foveal features and one is in your peripheral, and actually we oscillate between the two, between peripheral and foveal vision, and you can actually start to see these features change slightly. So even just watching a static face is very dynamic. Let me blast through these. The other thing that the mask does is, in taking away your focus on the face, it pushes it to the body. And dancing was incredibly important, as we know, in the ancient Greek world. Just read Plato. We have an uncanny ability to recognize movement when it's moving. Watch. And you don't even play soccer or cricket, karate, right? These are just points of light in a human body. If that was you, you'd recognize yourself. If that was a friend, you'd recognize them. Let's get to some neuroscience. Here's an fMRI machine. Not too many of them hang around in classics departments. The limitation of neuroscience is we can't yet wear these on our head and go out into the world. That's a problem, right? We will be able to soon, I hope, and you've all seen these images. Let's be real about the limitations of neuroscience. Ultimately, the brain scan that you get is not the brain being scanned, it's an approximated brain. And these are huge areas in terms of what's going on in the brain. It's not very accurate, but nevertheless, it's still amazing cutting-edge science. And I think in hand with psychology and cultural studies can come up with some amazing findings. One done at University College London looked at ballet dancers. This is actually my wife, Desiree, when she was principal ballerina at the Metropolitan Opera. There she is. And this is me over here. That's not me. Anyway, we took ballet dancers. They took ballet dancers and they put them in fMRI machines and they watched ballet. And their mirror neuron system, or mirror neuron mesh, we should call it, fired as if they were doing the dancing. When they put capoeira dancers watching ballet, nothing happened. And the same when they switched. So if you're familiar with that art form you're watching, you're going to have a very intense relationship with it. For those of you interested in the science, there it is. Now we know that pretty much every single Athenian in the audience would have performed, statistically, would have performed at least once in a dithyramb or a tragedy. So these guys were expert dancers. Go to see ballet with a ballet dancer. They kind of twitch while they're watching. I say to my wife, "You're twitching." What? No, I'm not. You are. Will you stop twitching? She's doing those jetés, whether she likes it or not. I mean, it's an amazing experience. So again, there's a much deeper connection between that original audience watching that performance and perhaps us watching the performance today. We have problems with choruses. I think the chorus for the ancient Athenians were one of the most exciting elements in watching tragedy. And look, notice the overextended hands, the feet. Here's some of my masks in operation in a production of Pirandello's 6 Characters, and the actors are inherently using their bodies far more. How much time do I have? Am I good, Walter, for a bit? Okay, you guys all right for a little bit more of this stuff? All right. So let's get controversial now. Right. Ekman's 6 basic emotions. I hate this theory. Right? I work in the theatre. I hate the theory that there's 6 basic facial emotions. But I'm going to show you in a minute that the mask can only do those 6 basic emotions. However much I try and make the mask do other emotions, it can do those 6. And I've done these experiments all over the world. So even though there's some cultural difference in the way that we perceive emotions, one can think of David Constance's book on the emotions in the Greeks. At the end of the day, most of us will recognize these 6 basic emotions, right? Which are anger, fear, disgust, surprise, joy, and sadness. Ekman's added some non-facially shown emotions: amusement, contempt, contentment, embarrassment, excitement, guilt, pride in achievement, relief, satisfaction, sensory pleasure, and shame. But the mask really can't show these things on their own. And then there's Aristotle's wonderful list of emotions, which are sort of opposites, right, from the rhetoric: anger and mildness, love and enmity, fear and confidence, and so on. But these are not theatrical emotions. These are the emotions of persuasion. So I'm going to come back to this. I think I need to show you a mask, right? Yeah. What I would normally do is put a mask on you, but for time I'll do it, okay? Remember, I'm not an actor, so forgive me. Here's a mask that was done for 6 Characters: Search of an Author by David Nez. But we constructed these masks based on evidence from ancient vases. So they're not reconstructions of ancient masks, they're a sort of modern version. David completely disagreed with me about how a mask should be made. And the first group of masks were completely wrong because he read the play. That was the mistake. What do I mean? Greek masks are not neutral, nor are they a fixed character. They're not a stamp. They're ambiguous. They have an ambiguous expression which is capable of change. So I'll put this mask on, which is a female mask, and give me some emotions, and I'll try them. Right? Whatever you think. Okay, so fear is the first one. See that? You buy that as fear? Okay, good. Another one. Yep. Another one.
Joy.
Oh, that's my phone. Yeah, I'll call you back. How about some non-Ekman ones? Maybe. But you said satisfaction, so, you know. Any more? Shame. It's hard. Let's try it. I'm actually feeling anger, which is interesting. Any others?
Repentance.
Wow. I can't do it. Any more? Yeah.
I noticed that you're moving your body,
Yes.
and that's highly suggests,
That's right.
you know, that can we do that, those motions without?
I don't believe so. I think I have to move my body, and that's exactly right. That's exactly what's happening. And I think that your cognitive system is seeing and suggesting the mass moving, right? That can become an old lady or a young man and really change, right? So this is my favorite. That's how you do children in Greek tragedy, right? There it is. So I'll come back to them, but I want to just show you what I mean by that. An fMRI study done in Japan with no masks. Look at these masks. Thick bottom lip, smooth areas around here, large brim, similar functions. This mask is the same mask in 3 different angles and seems to have a different expression, right? But the face can't do that. Now, one thing I was going to do, but it was a bit complicated, there's a software called CERT that reads your facial emotions. You can download it and play with it. And you can sit there and it will read your face and it will tell you your 6 basic emotions, right? And it's really interesting because you should have it on when you're working because it's very telling. When you put a mask on, it reads surprise, 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 surprise. Even though I could go through those 6 basic emotions, which you all saw, right? The computer can't do it, right? The computer cannot, thank goodness the computer can't do it, right? So this is, of course, Gregory's great experiment about the turning mask. Let's watch this, right? So watch this mask turn. There's the back of the mask, but hang on, what just happened? Let's do that again. Stop that happening. You know that's the back of the mask, but wait. Whether you like it or not, your evolutionary system is going to make you see faces, right? Everywhere. Jesus in a tortilla, right? Guy got a lot of money for that. One of the most famous photographs of portraiture of Churchill in everybody's room in World War II. Great story. Yusuf Karsh was trying to take a photograph of Winston Churchill in Ottawa. He did not want his photo taken. He was mildly drunk. And he was coming out of a meeting smoking his cigar, and Karsh grabbed the cigar and snapped his photo. Churchill is just really angry that he's had his cigar taken away, right? But what comes across is defiance against the Nazis, right? I mean, that's what we get, right? Perfect caricature. Now, science has proven that we prefer caricatures. In fact, we prefer schematic versions. If you take children and you put them in a room with a couch and you have a toy, and then you create an absolute facsimile of that room as a pure model and a facsimile of the toy, and you hide the toy under the facsimile couch, then you send the kid into the room, the kid won't find the toy. But if you draw a rubbish sketch of the couch and the toy, the kid will find it straight away. We love doing lines in sand. We love doing hexagrams, right? And it's the same thing with faces, is that we prefer caricatures. When you show people caricatures of people they know or famous people and then show them photographs, they recognize the caricatures much faster. Says Churchill, right? 4 more years. That does not look like me. These are Aaron Sugar's Mooney faces. And look, from the merest of information, we can see ethnicity, we can see gender, and we can see age. It's remarkable. Well, this has been called, of course, the uncanny valley, right? And those of you who saw Avatar, right, know that James Cameron said, I've crossed the uncanny valley. What's the uncanny valley? Well, Michiro Mori in 1970 said there's this gap here, this valley, right, where basically here's a sort of healthy person here, right, and here's a puppet, and here's a corpse. Something that looks like a human up to about 96.5% we really enjoy. Once we get into the valley, we're looking at a zombie and we're repelled. And nobody yet has crossed the uncanny valley. It's there's going to be people here working on video games, right? Trying to create something that crosses the uncanny valley. This is one attempt. I personally want to stove her head in with a pickaxe handle, right? That's right there in the uncanny valley. Let me show you, I think I've got here, some of the game theory, doing the basic emotions, right? It's horrible, isn't it, right? They are way in the uncanny valley, but look at this. Look at her. Is this going to start? Yeah. This is image metrics. This is, cutting edge. She's computer generated. But look at her eyes. Get the pickaxe handle. It's a zombie, right? So we're not there yet, right? We haven't crossed the uncanny valley. We prefer representations. She's good, but... So the reason why you were seeing those mask changes is because you're wired to do that. And as I say, I've done this all over the world, and it works. So we see those 6 basic emotions. If we had some text, we would get far more out of them. Text is important. And just to finish, right, because I should, I'll show you one more experiment. This is the famous Kuleshov effect, right? Fans of Alfred Hitchcock will know this. We need text, we need costumes, we need narrative, because we need context to get out of those 6 basic emotions, to give us more depth of intensity. Watch this. This is from about 1915. And watch it again. This is an object in exercise in editing. So there's some soup. He's maybe hungry. Dead child. Very sad. Beautiful woman. Aroused. Well, it's the same clip, right? It's the clip is the same 3 times. And this was an example to Kuleshov students of contextual framing, which is absolutely how that mask works in that amazing environment. This is Mobb's version of contextual framing. Here's the science, right? The anterior temporal regions store contextual forms, memory. This is compared to information gathered by the superior temporal sulcus, which is responsible for gaze direction and emotional processing. Back to the eyes again. This information is tagged by the amygdala, part of the brain's limbic system responsible for memory and emotion, which in turn is influenced by top-down signals from the prefrontal cortex responsible for executive functions. So I'll just translate that into mask cognition. There's the narrative information that we get on stage. The mask and body, as you said, are altered by the performer. The mind processes the contextual frame. The spectator places the expression on the mask, and this elicits a deeply personal response. I believe the mask was far more expressive than the human face. And though there were 5,000 of you sitting out there, you were having an individual relationship with that masked actor. Incredibly powerful and deeply moving, on a level that perhaps we can't quite understand by going to watch these plays performed now in modern theatres. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. This concludes the official portion of this presentation. But if there are any questions left, please feel free to ask.
Yeah.
I was struck, and I want to sort of challenge you on the text thing for a
Yeah,
second.
of course.
I was struck when you put the mask on,
Yeah.
And before you started acting out the emotions, I found a similar effect when we had the two people with the one saying
Yeah.
God and one doing it. When somebody would call out the emotion, I saw the emotion.
Yeah.
That's the experience I felt. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if therefore the recitation of the text
Yeah.
with the mask actually then brings out what you want to see, and so the text does become important at some level.
That's good. Let's try one we didn't do without text, see if we can identify it, because I think it's a very good point. Let's use one we've had before. What do you see?
Frustration and anger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Frustration, anger. So,
Fury.
yeah, I think the 6 work without words. For time, I was just going through them. I think if we wanted to do love, I can't do love without words. So, yeah, I think I'm not negating text. Text is incredibly important, but I think it becomes more important as a piece of drama if we understand it working in tandem with the visuality of the mask. And I think certainly as a director, a lot of people go wrong with classical drama because the text becomes this sort of document that can't be changed. And I think that even us as classicists sometimes get locked into this idea of the text, the text, the text, the text. I don't think the Greeks would have any concept of what we were talking about. You know, to them, this was language delivered live in a theatre. And I even think the language is embodied. You know, I think when Clytemnestra talks about Calcubaphas, right? In that great moment where she's denying there's been any infidelity with Agamemnon, right? We hear Colchis, and we hear Baphas and the veil of Iphigenia, right? And the language itself is embodied. And I think Greek, as we all know, is a fantastically embodied language. So I think that for me, it's a way of laying the text on one side and finding some other tools to reach some conclusions, and then adding the text, which for me makes it a richer experience. So I was being a bit facetious in saying, let's get rid of the text, but I'm trying to find a different route into this material from cognitive science. Yeah, thanks, great point. Who wants to put a mask on? Yeah.
Just a quick question. I'm wondering, in terms of getting rid of the text, have you worked at all with some of the productions that do the text in Greek, like the Cambridge Greek play, or things like this? And I'm wondering, if so, I guess, like, how do you work with a text that presumably no one in the audience understands? And do you use, like, that seems like it's sort of a middle ground.
No, it's a great question. I do an exercise where I ask people to, I give each person an objective. I say, you've got to get $1,000 back. Your life depends on it. And the other person, I say, you've never seen this person before in your life, right? And they play out the scene, and it's kind of boring because they're acting. And then I take language away and say, you can only use letters of the alphabet in random order to express yourself. And suddenly their bodies come into play, right? And they want their money, and it's alive, and it works. And I think that actually, sometimes, like the McGurk effect, language gets in the way, you know? And with actors, they start acting, and we're aware that they're acting, and this isn't real. You know, so the mask is really interesting because you have to coordinate language. Everything you say is part of the embodied experience of acting in a mask. You can't fudge anything in a mask. And of course, most of Greek tragedy is sung, right? Well, that's a good thing because there is a construction. And if it's not sung, it's certainly closely metered, right, in a metrical form. And I think that's really important to understanding the way it would have been delivered in a mask. And maybe that's why when we hear dramatic Greek, it just sounds very alien to us and strange. But I think the form of the meter was very, very important. And, you know, there's been a lot of work done on meter in poetry and neuroscience and also in music. In fact, music was one of the first art forms that neuroscientists were interested in. And we mustn't forget that these things sung and danced, and what we call the text was really music. You know, it was really, there was a musicality to what was going on. So I think your point's very good, and it's valid. My problem sometimes with those sort of British public school kids doing Greek plays is it doesn't sound like Greek anymore. It sounds like some horrible, it sounds like a text, right? Isn't it great when you have Greek students, right? Maybe they don't know ancient Greek, but you say, read that bit of Homer, and it suddenly just sounds like a language. So I think Greek is so beautiful, and I think coming out of these masks, imagine this thing singing. I mean, it just would have, imagine Euripides' aria, it would have just been sublime. So, yeah.
I've been thinking about the issue of anticipation
Yeah.
and the issue of people knowing stories before they come into the theater.
Yes.
Right. And I'm wondering, textually speaking,
Mm.
because I think here we really just can't know about embodiment, but in text,
Mm.
are there any moments you can think of where what's been built into the text is actually a sense of contradiction
Oh,
of
sure.
expectation,
Oh, sure.
right? And how if suddenly you have to pay attention to the text because what Aeschylus is making somebody say is not necessarily what you would anticipate them saying,
Yeah.
how that then plays into what might be happening.
Well, I think you could take two examples. You could take an example where the audience know exactly what's going to happen, and Aeschylus frames it by using the embodied space. So the Watchman speech that opens the Oresteia, right, is that we know about the beacon, we know about this, right? But what he does is he gives us this disheveled guy popping up on a roof of a skene. It may have been one of the first times the skene was used, right? The first word is gods, right? Well, that's a way to get an audience's attention. So he says that religious word in that religious space in the sky, and then the first image he gives us is of the night sky and the cosmology, right? So by the time we meet the beacon, it's in the context of how well I've come to know night's congregation of the stars. Well, here's now a woman-made star being hung in the male firmament. So straight away, we start to see this beacon very differently than we might come to expect it. And then, of course, you can think of Euripides' Medea, where, Jason's banging on the door and he's saying, "Ecce claim the door," like roll out what's inside, but no, you're going to get the Mechina, right? And there it is above you. And we talked about this earlier. We have to be careful with, I don't think even Oliver necessarily believes this anymore, but Oliver Taplin's great work where he said, everything that happens on stage is implicit in the text. That's not true. In fact, in most theatrical traditions, if you say it, you don't do it. And if you do it, you don't say it. So there may be a whole level of irony and movement that's running counter to what's being said on stage, and we can only wonder what that may have been. But I do think that thinking about embodiment and movement gives us a whole kind of richer area that that the original audience may have experienced these plays. So I definitely think you see the playwrights deliberately kind of trapping the audience and leading them down these routes and pulling the rug from underneath them and surprising them all the time. There's another great example in the Oresteia where Cassandra is going to go into the house, right? And she's repelled, and she says, "I can smell the blood." And the chorus say, "That's only the smell of sacrifices." And of course, as the audience were watching the play, they would have been sacrificing, up to 800 at one point, animals in the altar behind. Well, if you didn't eat meat that often, the smell of burning flesh and blood, that's a very, very powerful smell. And so there's a sort of meta-theatrical embodiment thing going on at that moment with Cassandra. So thinking about those textual moments in a wider cognitive context, for me, really brings these plays to life. Yeah.
I'm wondering whether and how the mask affects the actor's own perception of their own body and the
Completely.
kind of emotions that they express and how they express it then and how this in turn impacts the audience.
Completely. Most actors now hate acting in masks. I've had actors have nervous breakdowns in them. They hate it. And I've learned never to rehearse in front of a mirror. Because if you put a mask on and the actor looks in the mirror, they become very self-conscious and it's over. You actually have to sublimate yourself to the mask. And being an actor in a mask is like being a dancer. And I did a project with Doug Vernon Dancers where I had dancers act and actors dance. It was a nightmare because dancers are used to being told what to do by a choreographer and killing themselves to do exactly what the choreographer tells them to do. And their artistry comes out of that, right? And actors used to having an opinion and telling an actor, particularly in the American tradition, this is what you're thinking and doing, and I want you to put your foot there. Actors aren't going to have this, right? Well, when you wear one of these things and there's no mirror, you are totally dependent on the outside eye. You need to be choreographed. And it's back to that again, right? So it's very disorienting, it's very difficult, and some of the tools that actors rely on, emotional recall, the method, or whatever you want to call it, are denied to you in a mask. And yet you have to do these incredible emotional performances, but they have to be ordered and they have to be constructed as dance may have been. So I think ancient acting is closer to dance. And again, I think that's where the meter and the music comes in, because we have this whole emotional richness that's conveyed by the music. That makes it, I think, that takes the pressure slightly off the actor. It doesn't mean they don't have to have great artistry, but perhaps their interpretation of how they might react to a scene is not as important as how this verse should be sung. So maybe opera has more of a clue there, that you can have sublime opera performers who aren't actually very good actors. It doesn't really matter, right? Because they're hitting those notes. Yeah.
I wanted to ask where you would draw the line between interpretation versus cognition.
Yeah.
And this comes from your comment that cognition is affected by culture.
Yes.
And so when we're trying to reconstruct Greek cognition, how
Yeah.
much do we have to worry about the question of interpretation? And I'm thinking particularly the photos of the vases and the mask. And you said, we notice, look at the big eyes versus the big nose.
Yeah.
But I think from viewer to viewer, you would notice something differently. And
Yeah.
let's say you did have the East Asian culture then
Yes.
trying to reconstruct Greek cognition, well, then we have a totally different account of this.
I think, we are in the business of reconstruction, right? That's what we do as classicists, and interpretation. And I think what's interesting is that people working in neuroscience are facing the same issue, even on contemporary culture, which is whose culture, what differences are there in culture, what about subcultures, right? What about, post-traumatic stress disorder? How all these things affect how you cognate, which I think is where the field's so fascinating. Let's be honest, every judgment we make about the ancient world is a judgment based on interpretation, right? So I'm trying to find some new tools to add to that process of making judgments. Some of my work, the cognitive stuff, leads me maybe back to a conclusion that I might have made in the first place. But sometimes looking at a Greek vase as an ancient thought rather than an aesthetic object is so liberating to think about, why was this made? Who made it? Who bought it? Where was it found? What was its function? Why are these people looking at each other like that? What's this gesture mean? Why are they holding this? We don't often do that in our subject. So I think for me, it's just been able to free me into going at a subject I love from a different angle. I don't think that it's perfect, just like literary theory is not perfect, but I think it gives us some tools. And I think it can work in tandem with literary theory and philology and other elements of that we have at our disposal. I do think that we can get close to the ancient brain. I do believe that. And that's a bigger part of my project. And I do think that we can start to identify ancient thoughts in text. Because if an object is an ancient thought, then so is a text. So isn't that an exciting way to think about a text? Is that we have a recording of a series of ancient thoughts. To me, as a classicist, that's incredibly exciting. Because now I'm in the presence of that brain. And now I'm having an engagement that is, very fruitful for me. So yes, it's a difficult area, and I'm on the edge of it, right? Cognitive classics, right? This is it. But and I whistle stop tour you through it. But I think there's a lot there that can be of use to us. But no, it's not perfect. Yeah.
It was the role of the mask in cognition in satyr plays. Am I right in thinking that in the comedies, the audience would not have known where they were going beforehand as much?
Yeah, thing about comic masks, I didn't bring one, is they're much more expressive. They're more bulbous, they've got bigger features, and the movement in comedy is actually much lower to the ground, right? And much more kind of weighty, and the costumes that they wore, the bulbous stomachs and buttocks, and it's a different art form, okay? And the comic mask, I think, is actually a different kind of mask. The satyr mask is a tragic mask adapted for a satyr play, definitely. And of course, it was the same actors that performed the tragedy that did the satyr play. And I think the satyr play is a sort of a not so subtle version of a tragedy. I think a comedy, if we're talking about old comedy, is actually a different genre and starts to speak more and more to tragedy by actually making fun of tragedy. Think about the play, particularly the later plays of Aristophanes that have huge pastiches of Euripides plays. In fact, many Euripides plays are only known to us from those pastiches. So they start to fuse together. And I think what's so interesting is satyr, play, comedy, tragedy, and dithyramb all start to speak to each other. So, you know, the new music of Euripides is probably inspired by dithyrambic music. And I tend to think that, I'm going to say this in my book, and maybe I'll get attacked for it, I think the spread of tragedy is because of music. I think the new music was the Rolling Stones. And I think when people heard it, they were like, oh my God, this stuff is... You look at Plato's complaints about it, you know? How can you do that with music? This is Elvis, right? This is the Sex Pistols. And I think people wanted the music, which is why I think Euripides is, you know, everybody wants to hear Euripides. So I think, you know, music conveys that spread of Greek tragedy. But there is, what's so exciting is how these forms, you know, start to speak to each other and literally embody each other as well, as particularly towards the end of the 5th century.
My wife and I were students here in the early 70s, and T.B.L. Webster, who loved Euripides, said that same thing.
Oh, you did? Oh, I'm honored.
And
T.B.L.
they
Webster.
excited students by talking about the Rolling Stones and music.
Oh, great. Well, and he, of course, was a professor at UCL where I went, so that's a great comment. Have I exhausted you? I think so.
That brings us full circle.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.